biologists. It's Miss Ray here. We're going to be doing biology with Miss Ray, specifically Unit 3, Lesson 3 on cellular respiration. This is our last lesson in this unit. It can be a little tricky. There's going to be a lot of components that are going to sound similar and almost like photosynthesis, but aren't quite exactly that. With that in mind, you need to start studying and memorizing this immediately once we start the material. You're going to want to work with it every day, just for at least a little bit. And if you get behind, don't forget you can ask for help from Miss Judd or myself. All right, let's get started.
Cellular Respiration, Unit 3, Lesson 3, Guided Notes. Have your packet ready, and let's go on and get started. So, last lesson, we learned about photosynthesis, and we learned that photosynthesis requires water, sunlight, and carbon dioxide. Cellular respiration, which is the formula and the equation reaction we'll be learning about today, is exactly the opposite. So if you look at the bottom of this, you have the equation where you have carbon dioxide, water, and then through the process of adding light to it, you create glucose and oxygen. And it is exactly the opposite. So the product of photosynthesis, glucose and oxygen, is now the reactant or reactants for cellular respiration. We need to go on and record who, what, when, and where. So who? All living cells, all cells, plants, animals, doesn't matter, bacteria, all cells do this process. What's the process? The process that, again, cellular respiration is the process that releases energy from food in the presence of oxygen, also known as it's turning glucose into ATP. If you remember with photosynthesis, we took sunlight, turned it into ATP, and then the plants needed to store it for a longer period of time, so it turned into glucose, which is the long-standing or long-forming energy source. But cells regularly just need ATP to use. So when a cell is ready to use some energy, it takes the stored glucose, in the case of people who are organisms that eat food, the food that we eat, and turns that into ATP, or in the form of plants that is able to make glucose, it turns it back into ATP to be used. When does this occur? Always. Your cells are always needing energy, so the process is always occurring at some point. And where? It mainly occurs in the mitochondria. That is the powerhouse of the cell. But we also will know that it's sometimes, again, there's one part that will occur outside of the mitochondria in the cytoplasm instead. But the big case is this happens in the mitochondria. Here's our equation. Let's write this down. We have the chemical formula at the top, and then we have the more English scientific terms at the bottom. We also need to label that we have the reactants, which are the input, and the products, which are the output. So again, glucose and oxygen are what are needed to get started. Without either one of those, the process will not happen. And our products, what's produced, is carbon dioxide, water, and energy. Now, energy is the main product. Carbon dioxide and the water produced are actually just byproducts, which means they're not used so much. Now, the mitochondrion, powerhouse of the cell. Mitochondria is for many mitochondrion, and mitochondria is just one, but we usually just say mitochondria. So mitochondria are membrane-bound organelles that help regulate energy. These cells have mitochondria because they need to metabolize glucose or food into energy. Cells that have mitochondria, these are the prokaryotes, eubacteria, archaebacteria, and all the eukaryotes. In other words, all living things, all cells have mitochondria because all cells do cellular respiration. Now let's look at our image. Make sure that you've identified each thing. Now remember, mitochondria is a membrane-bound organelle. And so you have your outer membrane and your inner membrane, two different sort of barriers. Now inside the second membrane, the inner membrane, you have the matrix, and it's made up of these sort of folds that we call the cristae. And then the open space outside between the inner membrane is called the inner membrane space. In your notes, you have this table. We're going to go step by step. So in photosynthesis, you had 2 steps. You had the light dependent reaction, and then you had the Calvin cycle. Well, cellular respiration has 3 steps. The first step is glycolysis. Its location is in the cytoplasm. Remember, this is the one exception to everything happens in the mitochondria. It's just outside of it. What happens is it takes one glucose molecule, remember that's what we need to start it, and it breaks it down into pyruvic acid. And this releases energy in the form of ATP and NADH. Now, NADH is not the same as the NADPH that is found in the photosynthesis, but it has the same sort of connotations where we add and take away that H, that hydrogen ion, and that's what allows us to charge up our batteries and hold energy versus releasing it when that H is not present, when the hydrogen is not present. And our last word, we're going to learn more about what this word means, but this is an anaerobic process. Our input is glucose. We need to write the chemical formula too. And our outputs are pyruvic acid, which we'll be using the next step. And then we also have 4 NADH molecules and 2 ATP molecules. Make sure you understand that the numbers in parentheses afterwards are the countings that we're, again, looking at. As we can see here, we take glucose. We, again, create ATP and NADH, and we also have pyruvic acid. Now, understand that when we make ATP, we also had the presence of ADP present because we had to charge it up to then become ATP. And just like, again, we have NADH, it had to come from something. It comes from NAD+. So when we charge it up and it holds energy, it becomes NADH. Second one, Krebs cycle. This occurs in the matrix, which is inside the mitochondria. And remember in your picture image, you should know where that is now. This takes the pyruvic acid from the previous part and breaks it into CO2, the gas. This is going to release also NADH, more of it, this new molecule, FADH2, and ATP. FADH2 is another hydrogen-carrying molecule, which also stores just a little bit of energy, and we'll be using that later on. We started out with the pyruvic acid that came from glycolysis, and we ended up with the CO2 gas. That's what we breathe out. And we get 2 molecules of ATP, 6 molecules of NADH, and 2 molecules of FADH2. Again, this happens in the Krebs cycle, which is happening inside the little folds called the matrix. Its main outputs are ATP, NADH, and FADH2. The third one, we sometimes have broken this up into 2 actually, ETC and ATP synthase, but we simplified it just to be ETC, or electron transport chain. This occurs in the inner membrane space, so just outside of the matrix, inside the mitochondria though. Its description is high energy electrons from NADH and FADH2, so it takes those molecules that we made in glycolysis and Krebs cycle, it takes all of those, moves down the transport chain, taking those H's from the NADH and the FADH2, takes those hydrogen ions into the inner membrane space. Those hydrogen ions combine with oxygen. That's why we need the oxygen. So we breathe in the oxygen. That's what's going. It goes into this inner membrane space, and it takes those hydrogens, breaks them to release energy to make ATP, and those hydrogens attach to the oxygen and make water. And again, we take those ADPs and turn them ATPs. And this is an aerobic reaction. Now, the ingredients that we need, the input, we have oxygen, which we breathe in. We have the 10 NADHs. Those 10 come from glycolysis and Krebs cycle. 2 FADH2s, which came from the Krebs cycle. And we create water, H2O, and it's a water vapor. If you hold your hand in front of your mouth and you breathe, you'll notice that there's a little bit of moisture on your hand along with the warmth. And that's actually the water. You're breathing out the water on the water vapor that's created when you do this process. And then we have 30 ATPs. Those 30 ATPs were charged up from the energies taken from the NADH and the FADH2s. Now, as you can see here, you can see where we're taking the NADHs, the hydrogens separate, it moves across the membrane, we're moving things, we create that water. And then, of course, we're taking the energy that then is going to be over here to create the ATP. So you can see how we're moving the hydrogen ions over across the membrane space and we're creating ATP with them. Quick explanation. We just went over aerobic cellular respiration. This is where we put glucose and oxygen in, and we get 36 ATP and water coming out. The 36 comes from, we had 30 from ETC, and then we had the other ones coming from glycolysis and from Krebs cycle. Now, cellular respiration. This is just our overall picture. We have this in our notes. You can see where, again, glycolysis happens outside of the mitochondria, but inside the cell. Then we go to the Krebs cycle. Then we go to the electron transport chain. And as you can see, ATPs are being put out. And then we also have carbon dioxide and water leaving. Now let's talk about the role of oxygen. So we just went through the aerobic cellular respiration, and that means that there's oxygen present there. And that's for organisms that breathe oxygen or in the presence of oxygen. They're able to do this. This yields a lot of energy. But sometimes there are places where we either don't have enough oxygen to do the process, or there's just no oxygen present. We can do a little bit to still be able to get a little energy, not as much as our aerobic, but we can do that. And then there's some organisms that completely live off mostly again, anaerobic or non-oxygen present form of cellular respiration. So within the cellular respiration, there are steps that require oxygen and there are those that don't. We designate these types of steps into two parts. Aerobic respiration. This is the process that requires oxygen. The majority of the cellular respiration is aerobic because it takes place in the mitochondria where the oxygen goes. And this is the Krebs cycle and then the electron transport chain, which actually uses the oxygen to then collect the hydrogen ions and turn those into water. Then we have the anaerobic. And remember, like abiotic versus biotic, having that AN in front of it means no. So it's really just saying no air or no oxygen respiration. This is a process that does not require oxygen and can be performed where there is no oxygen present. And in this case, we have two different types. We get either alcoholic fermentation or lactic acid fermentation, depending on what we have and what organism is doing the process. In this case, glucose goes in. We don't have the oxygen component, but we can still make a little bit of energy from it. Now, as I said before, anaerobic respiration is a process that does not require oxygen and can be performed where there's no oxygen present. We have that in our notes already. But let's talk about the first anaerobic respiration process is glycolysis. So we already know this. This is the first step that we already studied. And this occurs in the cytoplasm. Again, we already know this. And it does not eat oxygen. It just uses the glucose because it breaks it down into pyruvic acid. Now, if an organism has enough oxygen, then it's just going to go on to the Krebs cycle and later on to the ETC. But that's not always the case. If an organism is in an area that has no oxygen, doesn't have enough oxygen, has a buildup of the products of glycolysis, or just needs quick energy, then it's going to do a type of process called fermentation. So humans don't do this process a lot because it just doesn't end up with as much energy as if we went through the full aerobic cellular respiration. But there are times where humans do this, especially when we need quick energy. So again, fermentation is that process. Product is usually NAD plus as the small energy source rather than a lot of ATP. Now, there are two types of fermentation. We have lactic acid fermentation. This is usually done by fungi and bacteria, but humans, we can do this too. This is usually done by athletes when we need quick energy source, when they're like, for example, sprinting. But it's not enough to function off of full time. So most organisms that do this, unless they're really, really tiny, like fungi or bacteria, they have to do the main type of aerobic respiration mainly. You also have alcoholic fermentation, and this is done by yeast and also some bacteria. Now, interesting fact, by introducing bacteria, fungi, and yeast to many of our foods, we use the fermentation process to prepare certain types of foods and drinks. For example, breads that rise, these breads have yeast in them. And what's actually causing the bread to form those little air pockets and things, that's actually the carbon dioxide that's being given off um, by the yeast in this process. Yogurts have bacteria that do this process. Alcoholic beverages, which are usually done by certain types of, again, yeast and fungi and bacteria. You have kimchi, pickled vegetables like pickles. Those are all things that use these organisms to actually create the chemical process that creates the taste that we enjoy. So as you can see, they start out with glucose, but one makes pyruvate one makes lactate and one makes ethanol. And again, the byproduct, what is at the end of it, is it gives off the energy and also the CO2. Now, you have practice on this next page. There's actually an additional practice. You don't have to do that right now. The first part of the practice, you're going to use the word blank to fill in these parts. These come from your notes. You have this information in your notes. You can complete this. The second table is to help you with counting. Remember, we put a lot of things in parentheses with numbers. You're going to take those numbers, transition them over, and then we're going to figure out how many of those NADHs actually turn into ATPs so we get our final ATP count. And again, you can do this with the notes that you have. Make sure you read carefully. It will tell you how to multiply and do all that kind of stuff. All right. Congratulations on finishing your notes. Great job.